Hey, this is David. The podcast you are about to hear was recorded using an exciting new technology called Zoom, and as a result, the audio fidelity is slightly less awesome than some of our other shows have been. I sort of apologize for that, but that's the internet for you. You can consider this our grunge episode because that's the subject, and it sounds slightly grungy. Definitely audible, but you come to us for a high-fidelity audio experience, and I wanted to explain why this may vary somewhat from our usual quality standards. Nonetheless, I am certain you will enjoy this episode right now. Okay, welcome to Rock Ducks, a podcast about movies about music. I'm David Lizerbram, here with my co-host,
Andrew Keatts.
And today we are going to be talking about a movie called Hype. But before we get to that, I want to introduce our very special guest co-hosts. If you're on a podcast and you're not a very special guest, you're nobody. I mean, that's the minimum. But in this case, they are in fact both very and special. Jeff Terich and Candice Renee. They are a multi-hyphenate. Can I say that too? Is that another cliche? Team. They are in addition to a married couple, they are the people behind. They've got a band. They've got a website. They've got a lot. Why don't you guys introduce yourself? I'm gonna stumble over myself.
I just want to see where you're going with this. Yeah. How many ways can you describe us? We do a lot of stuff.
You've got Blood
Ponies. Yes, So we have a band called Blood Ponies, formerly based in San Diego, now based in Richmond.
Yes, but even that band's been around for about 5 or 6 years, or maybe even longer than that.
It started in 2015. We played a set of Cure covers on Halloween. That was our first show. That was our first show.
Killer first show.
Yeah, no,
it was a fun first show.
Not a bad way to start out, for sure. Yeah. But yeah, even longer than that, Jeff founded a website way back in 2003 when people were still talking about blogs like they were a hot new thing. It is a music site called Treble, which he has been running for almost 20 years now.
20 years. Although for at least the first 10 years or so, I didn't really know how to run a website. So so it existed, but it was still being, not really knowing what I was doing. But now, after all this time, I feel like I finally kind of know what I'm doing. So
at this point, we can safely say it is a full-fledged music news brand of sorts that I helped Jeff to.
When bands have heard of us, that's when I know that we're like onto something real. Yeah.
Well, when I learned about Treble, it was when Jeff and I used to work together. I don't know. Geez, that must have been 10 years ago now. And when it's treblezine.com. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a throwback to the era of zines. Little did I know, you launched when zines were still a thing.
We're still a thing.
They were. Yeah.
Zines are still a thing.
Zines are still a thing.
I know they are. That's true. I know. There's a lot of zine culture folks just got really angry at me right now.
I know.
Yeah.
Grunge is still a thing, which is going to be relevant to our conversation today. But well, check out Blood Ponies on Bandcamp, any place else that people find music, right? Or is Bandcamp the main spot?
Apple Music,
Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube.
All those places.
There are like vinyl copies floating around in the world. So
you can buy an overpriced resale version on like Discogs, or you can buy the original directly from us through Bandcamp.
Yeah, I don't want to derail this conversation too much, but somebody is selling a copy of our album for $50 on Discogs. So
wait, should I do that? Are you? It sounds like an arbitrage opportunity.
There's still original pressings available, so I'm not really sure how you were going to get the $50. But hey, good for you, I guess.
Yeah.
I
mean,
got to respect the hustle.
Flattered. I'm very flattered. I'll say that.
And treblezine.com. That's TREBLE zine.com. I particularly like the U2 series you've been doing, Jeff, because that's kind of really takes me back. But speaking of taking it back, let's talk about today's movie, which is Hype with an exclamation point. I love it when there's an exclamation point at the end of the movie. Hype.
Like two of our first four.
Yeah, we love punctuation here. That's what we're all about. It was released in 1996. It's a documentary. The director is Doug Prey. And one of you guys take it away and tell us what this movie is about.
Sure. So Hype is, so it came out in the 90s sort of while this was still pretty fresh in everybody's minds, but it's about the Seattle grunge scene in the 90s that produced bands like Nirvana and Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam. And those are the famous ones, but there's also dozens and dozens of ones that aren't famous. And that's, in a nutshell, kind of what it's about, how it became this sort of big buzz about this localized music scene up in the Pacific Northwest, where there were tons of bands, most of whom didn't get famous. But there was all this activity from major labels and even just like fashion catalogs and stuff, like basically taking it goes into the commodification of Seattle music culture as a product beyond music. You say, fashion and branding and all of that, which is it doesn't go too deep into that, but it does touch on that, and it's interesting for sure. But the gist is basically that because there were some bands that ended up getting really popular out of the scene, it sort of drew everybody's attention to this music community, which then sort of became exploited by big companies in a way, and that most of the musicians didn't really benefit from.
Yeah, they actually talk to your point about the whole idea of it being so commodified that it's like at one point somebody discusses seeing like a sticker that just says the word Seattle. It's been reduced so much that there's not a symbol, there's not an idea, it's just the word. They'll buy it, just print the stickers and put it in Hot Topic or whatever. It doesn't matter.
You don't need to know anything about this band other than they're from Seattle.
From Seattle, yes, exactly.
Yeah, so the documentary is kind of like a time capsule because it's about this era from the late 80s, early 90s, but the documentary came out in 1996, so that's also a million years ago.
Right.
And the first thing that kind of struck me is that it sort of presumes that a lot about grunge and Seattle music. This is not a documentary that starts with highlights, here's where it's all going to go. Here's Nirvana and Soundgarden and Pearl Jam. And then that kind of and then they go back. It just assumes that well, obviously if you're watching this, and care about grunge music. So they never at any point define what grunge is for the purposes of the documentary. Mm-hmm. And if Jeff and I can immediately already start going down a rabbit hole about how a lot of the bands that are showcased in this documentary are not really not what we would even consider grunge, but it's sort of it gets all mushed together as part of the Seattle experience. Yeah, so one of the bands that they talk to quite a bit is the Fastbacks, and they're not, they wouldn't be considered a grunge band. They're more sort of like a power pop band. The Melvins are sort of considered a grunge band, but they're also sort of a sludge metal band, and sort of where do we draw the lines? Are you grunge just by nature of being from Seattle and being part of the scene, or is it does it actually define the sound? And that's sort of where it becomes a little more ambiguous.
Yeah. And then the other thing that isn't in the movie really that I like a lot, I prefer, is just based on when it comes out. They don't spend much time talking about the secondary, derivative grunge sound that came from other cities elsewhere afterwards. Mm-hmm. There's not a extended period afterwards where they're Candlebox and Silverchair, man, that was the worst, Okay, but to be fair, Candlebox was actually from Seattle. That's true. Yeah, that's true. But or I don't know what Silverchair's, what they're Australian. Yeah.
Silverchair
was Australian.
And like Bush, they were from England.
Bush, LA, yeah. And so but so there's no like that. It really, to Dave's point about it being a time capsule. They're really in the moment talking about the moment. They're not. If it was made 20 years later, there'd be an extended period where they're like, and then it died, and then Creed lifted Eddie Vedder's voice, and that was horrible, and we all hated it. And there'd be like this, there'd be like all this like unwinding what happened afterwards, but none of that had happened yet. So there's no real point.
Right.
They can't dwell in it,
And yet, from the perspective of the movie, this is all like some stuff that happened, and it's all over. Like the scene is definitely over from the perspective of most of the people speaking in the movie.
Whereas from the outside people perspective of like just learning about Seattle and just those people who were like just learning about grunge in the mid 90s, like to them it's still new and it's exciting and it's it's the cutting edge of coolness to them, but to everyone in the scene they're like, God, we moved on like 5 years ago. Where were the rest of you?
Yeah, this thing was dead by the time Nevermind hit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, just thinking about like some of the stuff that was happening, and I'm trying to remember like what bands were coming out of Seattle in the late '90s, and grunge was definitely kind of like a thing of the past by then. There were bands like the Murder City Devils. They were kind of like the new hotness at the time, and they sounded like Danzig. So
like the Kill Rock Stars era bands, stuff like that.
Right.
Another thing that I notice about this, which is just kind of has that time capsule element to it, is like, Andy and I've been watching, tons of rock docs for the, solely for the purpose of our obligations to the listeners of this show. And we're talking about like kind of who pops out in terms of the talking heads. We recently were talking about the Velvet Underground one. We haven't even recorded the app, but Mo Tucker just kind of like jumps off the screen, and Jonathan Richman as well. And they all kind of have that. And in this movie, like I was just kind of watching for that, and it sort of wasn't happening. And I just kind of feel like when this movie was filmed in like 94, 5, 6, like we hadn't all been trained by watching tons of documentaries and reality TV shows and social media to like know how to behave. Like we're all talking on a podcast right now, and we know how to do that, right? Because we've like listened to podcasts, we've done this.
So many examples,
right? Yeah. Exactly. So there's like you fall into this like this groove. Whereas in those days, like having a camera stuck in front of your face, unless you were, I guess, Eddie Vedder or somebody else, but for the most of the people that are interviewed, they'd probably barely ever been interviewed on camera before, and they weren't performing, or it was just kind of like I had to kind of settle into that groove because I wasn't initially finding the energy I was looking for.
For sure. Yeah. Jeff and I debated about whether or not this was a good film as a film. Like, did it hold your attention? Was it interesting? And I think a lot of that has to do with like documentary style of that time period versus documentary style now. To your point, David, like there's so much more in contemporary documentaries now. We see so much more setting up of these sort of like star interviewees, and everything from like camera work is more cinematic, and whereas this documentary has a lot of like a very home movie vibe in a lot of sense in certain certain elements of it.
Yeah, there's actually a series that we watched recently called This Is Pop, which I highly recommend, by the way. It's very entertaining. It's on Netflix. But it came out just, I think, earlier this spring, and it's very stylized. Mm-hmm. It's very, like, colorful, and it's very visually stimulating, and it's it's totally different than, like, what I grew up thinking documentaries, were supposed to look like. And so it's kind of interesting watching that and going back to this. And, you mentioned, like, unless you're somebody like Eddie Vedder, who's like famous, but even he in this documentary kind of comes across as sort of like reserved. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because it's like, he's the most famous guy in the whole movie probably, but, mm-hmm. but, he doesn't like project this rock star image. Although I think the person that stands out to me as being the most entertaining was, Gary Lee Conner of the Screaming Trees.
He was
like,
great.
We're nerds,
and we're a ton of band.
Yes.
Yeah, they were definitely doing bits.
Yeah.
So I'll throw Jack and Dino, I think, really stands out. Great talking head segments. And he also is the guy who I was disagreeing with you when you were first talking, Dave, because I think Andino's segments, like a supercut of just Andino from this film released as a podcast is something I would listen to. But no, to your all's point about how different the style of this documentary is to the golden era of documentaries that we're living in now, where every streaming service is putting out as many as they can get their hands on. Mm-hmm. It is totally different. And I blame it basically on 30 for 30. I think I might have said this on an episode we've recorded already, that like when 30 for 30 came out from ESPN about 10 or 15 years ago, they created this very stylized, very slick, very paint by numbers documentary style that has just taken over. It is just all documentaries now look like it and sound like it and follow the same beats. And this is so different. And I actually really like it because it's so patient. Like you just get to like plop down and hang out with these guys. The talking head segments are way longer than they would be now. They're not just like little sound bites. It's there's another one with Kim Thale from Soundgarden where I just want to give him a hug. He like goes through a whole thing of talking about his realization that there's no escaping commerce, and that no matter what you do, you have to live in society. It's like,
oh boy,
I've been there, man.
Something that artists struggle with every day.
And it's like the camera even like zooms in on him a little bit and pauses as he turns it over in his head. He's like, yeah, I can't get out of it. I just here I am.
It's the super great. 90s like concern with selling out, authenticity. Yeah. Like this is like completely a document of that. I mean, the most dramatic thing that anybody does in the interview is this guy Art Chantry, who is the designer or poster maker or something like that. And as he's talking and acerbically discussing this history of this movement of music and art in Seattle, he's taking these posters, these vintage posters of these bands from like the 80s, and saying, oh yeah, this is the first poster from Soundgarden's first show or whatever. It's probably worth $400, and he's taking like a cutter, one of those cutter things that like
real like paper cutters.
Yeah,
paper
cutters that you have in an office, and he's like slicing it in half, like dramatically, and he's he's narrating like, I'm destroying this valuable commodity, which now on eBay they'd probably sell for thousands of dollars, but it's such a pose. It's like, what? Why is this? Why do you think this is cool?
Well, I love how much you really get a sense in this movie about the contrast between sort of the grunge persona of this like disaffected, not really caring about anything, but then you also get the sense like you see from like the guys behind Sub Pop and the bands, like there is a layer of like performance and a layer of showmanship in the disaffectedness that there's it's so hard to tell, like, for outsiders from this community, like what's real and what's fake. That there's even a moment where they talk about, is it the New York Times, where
yes, it's so good,
where they made up the lingo.
Slang. Yeah, they made up grunge slang for this interview, and it just kills me because it's like the levels of artifice on top of artifice that exist within these creative communities. It's so easy to fool people who aren't part of these communities.
Yeah, I'm gonna find that list of fake grunge slang that they published and link to it in the show notes for this podcast, because
I remember a few of them. One of them is harsh realm.
What did that mean?
It just meant like bummer, like if somebody's having a bad day, it's like harsh realm, man, harsh realm. Yeah. And one of them was swinging on the flippity flop.
What the hell is that?
That's just like hanging out. And,
like what are you doing this weekend? Oh,
just swinging on the flippity flop. Which is even more ridiculous that like they believed that this was real.
Yes.
Because it's like, come on now.
Should I tell my kid that this is what we used to say when I was a teenager?
Totally.
You should, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Totally straight face. Just like, that's how we used to talk.
Well, so on like the very 90s concern about selling out and how, disaffected everybody is, I think that stuff all really aged really well, though. I think it's become very easy since 95 to think of young kids from that time, those Gen X concerns, as naive, as children who didn't get it. They were not world wise, and they thought they had this complex understanding of the world, but they were just naive and oblivious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually seeing them in the moment making the case in like a non-caricaturized way, they're totally knowing. They're very aware, and they have a great sense of humor about it. And it's like,
there's a level of sophistication and understanding of what's going on that like far exceeds what people's expectations of them were. I mean, which is like something you see today, right? Like when we have conversations about millennials and Gen Z, and the idea that like, oh, these kids today, they don't get it.
Right.
They'll get it when they're older, and they have, and they want to do whatever,
buy a house or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's like, no, we're constantly underselling whatever the youth generation is of the moment, and their ability to like understand the world.
Yeah, I think there was like an expectation that they were very dour about it. And it was actually like, no, they sniffed out that it was bullshit. And then they had a very good sense of humor about what it was, and just went on with their lives. And so I don't know. I thought like there's a clip that I guess Andy Rooney did, like an essay.
Oh my God, I laughed so hard. So hard.
And they included that clip in greater length in the Cameron Crowe Pearl Jam documentary during like a very similar segment about like the world casting its eyes of judgment towards Seattle. And they played a lot there. And like, hot take that Andy Rooney's out of touch. But like he couldn't sound more out of touch compared to what they are actually saying in the movie right next to him. They're not dour about it at all. They're quite whimsical about it, actually.
They have great senses of humor and like you say, a great understanding of like what's happening around them. It's really interesting. So I really wanted to hear, especially like from both of your takes as not necessarily as musicians. So like, Jeff and I had like a very distinct experience watching this movie as musicians and as people who are, have been part of a particular music scene and music community. Like there's such a universal experience of what that's like. Like we're part of a, goth post-punk, like dark music community within San Diego for several years, and but like we could still very much see like the same dynamics. Like there's a scene where one of a couple of the guys are like, oh yeah, well so and so was in that band with Nick's brother who was married, and then they formed this, and like that those are real conversations that happen in rehearsal spaces in music communities.
That's what local music scenes are like.
Like if you want to know what it's like to hang out with a musician for 2 hours, that's exactly what it's like.
I think there's one line where he's like Jim Miller wasn't in Butt Sweat, and the other guy's like, yeah, he played bass.
At one point they mentioned the band Cat Butt, who's shouted out in a Guided by Voices song. So I was like, oh, there you go. They're from Seattle. That's a little piece of trivia.
Nice.
But I don't know. I mean, it definitely was a documentary of a scene, and it was like, yeah, it's true. You could watch a documentary about Houston rap around DJ Screw, and they'll have kind of the same conversation, like, oh yeah, this guy was hanging out with this guy, or this guy was on this track with this person. It's like there is definitely a commonality and kind of a scene.
And there's that, like, whatever scene it is, whether it's, Atlanta rap or Seattle grunge, it's like, okay, here's the couple of people who blew up out of it, and then like here's the whole rest of the community that just kind of went on doing their thing. Yeah. Like that is universal to music communities.
Well, so to bring up Kim Thale again, because he did stand out to me as like one of the sort of main characters, I suppose you could say, in the documentary. But
also partially because Matt Cameron doesn't say a word, just standing next to him silently.
Just standing there, yeah.
And I think they're like standing next to like a campfire or something.
Yeah, you can see like the reflection.
These like flames reflected on his leather jacket, and you're just like, what the hell is going on?
Yes, totally. Yeah,
so Kim Thale he's talking about like the early days of the Seattle scene in like the late 80s, and he was like, yeah, it would basically be like you play a show and it's just the other 12 bands in town.
Oh my god.
Those are the people watching the band. Yep. And it's like,
that is the most real.
That's how it still is for any band that's not famous. Like that,
you're just playing for your
friends who are in other bands. That's what it's like. I mean, and it's not like it's a bad thing. It's just that's just how it works.
Yeah. The nature of scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like that was probably the way it was in Liverpool in 1961 or something like that. Like there's the Dave Clark 5 came and hung out at our club, our band, when Ringo was our new drummer, that's just kind of how I guess that's how it is. And then somebody blows up. But I kind of want to talk about so the movie goes along, and if you don't know anything about, if you had no idea about any of these bands or any of this whole scene, you'd be watching this and be like, well, did anybody become popular? Why are we even talking about this? And then about halfway through the movie, they show the first ever performance of Smells Like Teen Spirit. Most of the live performances in the movie, which is kind of interesting in its own right, are from around 95. So they're like club shots, but they seem kind of contemporary, like they were filmed by the filmmakers. At least is the vibe I got. Because you could just see like a difference in terms of the quality of the footage and so forth. But then there's some vintage footage, and you see Nirvana in whatever 1990, 89, and it's just like they completely blow just off the screen. I mean, there's just a reason why, there's some of these bands kind of blew up, and you could see from watching it doesn't seem like, it seems like if you were watching this if you're 18 years old and you're putting this on today in 2021 and you don't know about any of these bands, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's probably the one that got big, right? I mean, it seems obvious.
Yeah, it is really striking when you see that, admittedly, I'm sure for whoever filmed it, they would say, crappy footage of Nirvana playing Smells Like Teen Spirit for the first time. It's like, yeah, you definitely get a sense of, okay, we understand there's something that stands out in that moment from a lot of the other bands that you're seeing. But there's just to me, I was struck by, again, getting back to the idea of this is ostensibly about grunge, but as I was watching all of these live performances, the style and the different approaches to music that you're hearing from these different bands that they both talk to and just show live performances of, it's so diverse. There's so much different kinds of rock music happening in this documentary. For me watching it, that was the thing that I was like, there is not a cohesive style here jumping out to me. To me as a musician, that was something that I took away from it a lot.
Right. Yeah. There were a lot of bands. There were quite a few live performances that are in the movie. There's the Super Suckers, Gas Huffer. We're both punk bands. Fastbacks.
Mudhoney.
Mudhoney, who I think watching them is like, this band kicks ass.
No, that's what I think.
Well, yeah, sure.
Damn, Mudhoney is just
yeah.
They were just bringing it, and they were never, they never got the Nirvana treatment. I mean obviously they did okay.
They've always been a popular cult band, and they've kept it going for over 30 years. But so more power to them. But
they did have that appearance on Black Sheep with Chris Farley.
That's
at the Rock the Vote concert. Yeah.
But yeah, there's all of these different bands it sort of shows that what was happening at the time wasn't just grunge, and I don't know if that was the intent, but that's certainly like kind of our takeaway.
Well, and the other thing is that it's like really obvious, especially in the beginning of the film, is that it's not just Seattle. Like they're talking about bands from like around Washington, even bands from Oregon.
Right,
and
they showed
gets like lumped into Seattle.
There was a segment with the band Dead Moon, who are like famously a Portland band.
Yeah.
So you know.
Right. I mean, I think, back in the day, we didn't really know the difference. Unless you live there.
Northwest.
The nuances
it's all the same state, right?
Yeah. The nuances were lost on you unless you lived there, I guess.
There's in the beginning, the dude who slices up the flyers, the old show flyers. He sort of sets the stage by saying that the Pacific Northwest is a weird place, and he says something that like I've heard my dad say a million times about the Pacific Northwest, about how like it rains all the time and that's where all the serial killers are from, and you can't go any further north than it. And I gotta say, I always just assumed that would be like a cliche that people from the Pacific Northwest would resent hearing all the time.
Yeah.
And that they would like, that it would be like when people from San Diego keep hearing like, oh, well, you must never want to stay inside because it's so nice all the time, right? Like you just go outside, and that's why the sport. Yeah, that's why the sports teams, no one goes and sees the sports teams because it's you guys just go surfing all the time, right?
Yeah.
And, like I had just assumed that would be something that people from Seattle would not say, but he totally sets the stage with it. He also says that like as an example of how weird the Pacific Northwest is, like flying saucer as a term was created here.
That was something I learned. I did not know the original originators of that term.
The Manson family vacationed there, and Louie was written here. That's like that fits in there
with
to him.
Weird trilogy.
Yeah,
well,
I guess like the CIA had a file open on the Kingsmen or whatever, but
wait, hold on. I thought Louie was a Jamaican song.
Well,
I researched this because I was interested in it. So it was written by a black guy from LA, based on a calypso song.
Okay,
but he wrote it.
Sounds very similar.
In Seattle.
Stolen valor happening here from Seattle.
And then the Kingsmen from Portland covered it. So I have to assume that's what he was referring to.
Okay.
So they made it famous.
I guess so. Yeah.
I guess that's their claim.
He was too busy destroying priceless artifacts to get all the details.
He's a busy man. Okay, he can't be expected to know all the details.
No gods, David. No gods. No idols.
For the record, though, I don't understand what Louie being popularized there has to do with it being a place where people are interested in serial murder.
Well, to be fair, there was an FBI investigation into Louie, so
right. I guess
it all comes back to the feds.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I mean, I think on some level the whole serial killer thing is like a little bit of, and which brings me to something else that I want to mention in a minute. But the serial killer thing, I think there is some fascination up there because there are other artists from the Pacific Northwest who have like written songs about the Green River Killer and stuff like that.
Is that what Green River was named after? The band?
The river or the serial killer?
Yeah. What was that? Is that what that's a reference to?
I thought it was after the Creedence song.
Or was it the Creedence song? Right.
It could be. I thought it was just after a geographical location, but but there was the Green River Killer around that same time because he was prolific for kind of a long period, I thought.
Yeah. Were you going to mention the Keatts?
I was going to mention the Keatts. This was one of the weirdest things is that there was a live performance of the Keatts in the movie. And I think between the time that it was shot and between the time that it was released, their singer, Mia Zapata, was murdered. And it was actually like a really famous like crime in Seattle, in the 90s. And it was like a little eerie because they didn't mention anything about it.
Yeah, that was another thing. Again, I guess it like goes back to when this documentary was made. Like it was because I'm just very familiar with Mia Zapata's case and what happened. and the like music community's response to her death. So to see the performance of the Keatts and see her on stage, and then not like, and they don't even talk about the Keatts. They just show like a minute like of performance, and then they like move on. And I'm like, oh, there's a whole thing there that needs to be unpacked, but I guess we're not going to get there. But also maybe it was just the timing.
I think it was just the timing. I'm guessing that the movie was finished like probably around the same time that it happened, but it's hard to say, but I do know that they do sort of like line up pretty closely, which is kind of weird.
Mm-hmm. So what would you guys, how different do you think the movie is if they make it in 2015 than making it in 1995?
Well, I think we definitely would have that conversation about bands like Creed and
the sort of second wave,
the post-grunge,
the spin-offs that erupt from that.
I also think we'd probably see a lot more Dave Grohl.
Oh
yeah, right.
I'm actually surprised about that. The conversation around Kurt Cobain didn't like entirely dominate the film, which I liked. Because there is so much media about Kurt and Nirvana already. So to be able to touch on it in a way that like you obviously acknowledge significance because you can't not, but to not dwell on it obsessively was refreshing.
I also think it was entertaining how like early on, I think it was Jack and Dino that pointed it out, saying that like they're actually from Aberdeen.
yeah, right. So they released the director released a movie. I don't know if you guys have seen this. It's about 20 minutes long, called 20 Years Later After Hype, or 20 Years After Hype.
Oh no,
I didn't know that. Yeah,
and it's on YouTube. And he gets a lot of the people back, and Dino's in it. Kim Thale, the woman who was the manager for Soundgarden and Alice in Chains. I can't remember her name.
Susan Silver, that's it. And so there's a bunch of people are all back. And one of the things that they say, Mark Arms says, is, you guys were working on it so long, I really wish you had finished before Kurt died. Because Kurt dying at all introduces this heaviness to the proceedings that I don't think were part of our scene at all. It didn't feel heavy to me at all. So that's interesting. That's Mark Arm's take on the matter.
Yeah, I mean that does sort of that event completely changed the dialogue around the scene, right? And it's like, can you have a conversation about this moment in music history and about the culture and the art that came out of it without having the conversation about Kurt's death? Right. It's really interesting to try and like separate those two things.
They also didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but even before that, Andrew Wood of the band Mother Love Bone died of a heroin overdose, and I think that's sort of what inspired the whole Temple of the Dog record that came out in like 1992, I think. And so, and then
Chris Cornell in the Cameron Crowe Pearl Jam documentary, he says that people always get grunge wrong when they describe Kurt's death as the end of the Innocence. That actually it was Andy Wood's death was the end of the Innocence, and so that had ended before anybody knew anything was going on in Seattle, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Kurt Cobain's death was significant on a wider scale, but Andrew Wood's death definitely affected on a local scale, just because like he was such a big part of what was going on. But there is kind of a lot of tragedy associated with the Seattle scene, because several years later, two members of Alice in Chains died, and then Chris Cornell died a few years ago, and it's just kind of weird, that it's sort of like almost inescapable in a way.
Well,
I think if the movie was made now, there would be a lot more of a PSA, the ills of drugs and alcohol vibe.
Sure.
Well, it's interesting to if I can mention another podcast, that I
No.
listen to.
We're going to
Seems fine as long as it,
Nobody
There
as
are
long
no
as
other
it
podcasts.
rocks as hard as rock gods. Yeah.
I think it was. I'm trying to think of where I heard this assessment of Kurt's death, and I think it was the podcast You're Wrong About. And I think it was actually an episode they did on Courtney Love, but it kind of talks about. They kind of frame it in the sense that, like, which people have framed it before, is like, here's someone who was just like, who, you know, was dealing with probably like mental illness, you know, a number of things that they just weren't being thrust into that like spotlight was just like truly like the wrong thing for that human being. You know, they just like were not cut out as a human being to be under such like intense media scrutiny. And so it's kind of interesting to think about that in comparison to all of the other musicians that you know get interviewed in this documentary. And like Andy, to your point of like there's a savviness and an understanding of like this media complex that's going on around them. Whereas, you know, you have someone like Kurt Cobain who, while he may have like understood it, he really shouldn't have been a part of it. Like that was not the space for him as an individual. But of course, he's the one that gets plucked and put into that position to have to deal with it and process it. When there were, you know, a lot of people in the community who maybe would have, if they had been the one in that position, would have had a very different outcome.
Right.
I think the irony is that there's another person in his band who was perfectly well suited to deal with it, as we know. I mean, Dave Grohl is
true.
So temperamentally, I mean, you can say whatever you want about him, but he seems relatively healthy as a person, and
he seems equipped to exist in a media
very comfortable in his own skin. And is
if a golden retriever could be a rock star.
Wow, that's like the perfect way to put it.
Yeah. He must have just
Courtney Love, another person conspicuously absent from this film, basically. You know, like
I also was waiting for that shoe to drop. Like, when are we going to get introduced to this?
And Jeff and Stone aren't in it at all either. Interestingly, right? I mean, they're talked about in their photos up there, but they don't.
Well, there's a performance of Pearl Jam doing "Not for You," so
that's true.
But I mean, but I mean, it's not about discussing every member of every band.
Right. That's true. Right.
I think they wisely avoided getting it. I mean, Courtney Love is deserving of a lot of, you know, explanation and attention of her own. I mean, getting into her role. I mean, I don't know that she had that much of a role in terms of the Seattle scene or what the movie's talking about.
Well, no, she wasn't even originally from the Pacific Northwest.
I thought she was from Olympia, but I could be wrong.
She moved around a lot, so I'm not entirely sure where.
Right, but I don't think she was there in the 80s when this was happening.
Probably not. But you know, there are other bands that are sort of part of the grunge conversation that we didn't actually see. One that comes to mind is the band L7. Who weren't in it.
They're an LA band though, right?
I thought that they were from Seattle. I could be wrong though.
I know. I know. And Dino produced a couple of their records.
And they were also a sub pop band. So so we'll have to do some fact checking on that.
They toured with Pearl Jam, I remember, in the 90s.
So I have a theory. Can I get into my theory? I have a theory that I want to discuss with everybody. Where this ties into like all of rock history. But I mean, the four bands that came out of this whole thing that obviously became huge: Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains, basically. And like still to this day, like each of those, you know, like they're streaming their big bands, right? So, I mean, the reality is, if you watch this movie and you really think about it and you look at those bands, the thing those bands have in common, that for better or worse, those other bands do not have, is a very handsome, square-jawed, leaning man, right? I mean, all four of those lead singers, like if you gave them a haircut, they could be on like a soap opera, right? That's just the reality.
That's true.
There is an element of that for sure.
Really, what they became is TV stars. I mean, MTV is huge, like in those days, and they were on TV all the time. They weren't on, you know, a daytime soap, or they weren't on ER next to George Clooney, but they were still TV stars by any definition. And so I was thinking about it, like the first example that I can think of the hard rock band with the lead singer that looks like a male model is the Who, right? And then you've got like the Doors, Led Zeppelin.
The Doors,
yeah. You've got Van Halen.
Grateful Dead, but only during the Pigpen era.
Not really. I mean,
I'm just kidding.
I thought you were trying to shoehorn Bob Weir, a young Bob Weir in there, but
I'm standing for Pigpen. All right, okay. Pigpen was the front man.
I mean, really, like if you're a young person and you're watching MTV and it's you're 10 years old or whatever, and you see Bon Jovi, Poison, Warrant, and Guns N' Roses with the handsome leading man. I mean, and then you see Nirvana or you see Chris Cornell. As music fans looking back on this 30 years later, we can see a distinction and go, oh, that's totally different. They weren't doing the same thing at all, but there is a marketing appeal that those bands had. And
they're all very photogenic.
Yeah. I mean,
and I was wondering
that anyone gets, especially, I don't know how to compare then to now really, but I mean, to think that anyone is getting a major label deal without being extremely visually marketable, is just kidding ourselves.
Well, these days it's all about like Spotify streams and stuff like that.
There was an era in rock when that wasn't important. When you had Boston and you had Chicago and bands like that nobody even knew.
All the city bands.
Right. Yes. Exactly.
Exactly. Well, yeah. No.
Corporate rock bands.
It was not. Yeah. Not part of.
Nobody was sprung for Steely Dan. But that's a different era. Like that was considered to be less authentic.
Speak for yourself, David. All right.
I want that on a t-shirt.
I'm getting deep into this theory. The point being that here's this music that's advertising itself as very authentic, but there is still a very surface marketing level thing going on, and it's not like they didn't know that this was happening. And the movie didn't really address that, but. I would love to know what some of the other people from that scene thought about, those bands and the reasons why they became so popular. I mean, certainly all great songwriters and everything else.
Yeah, it's not that being beautiful people makes the music inauthentic, but you're absolutely right. I think I'm sure that there's probably like the marketing wing of these record labels probably
100%
probably took a look at them and said like, oh yeah, we can sell this. We can sell this 100%.
Yeah. See,
and the Sub Pop guys.
Go ahead, Andy.
I was just gonna say, and the Sub Pop guys are like pretty forthright about like how savvy they were about marketing the hype around Seattle. That they leaned into it. They weren't too cool for school about that at all.
Oh yeah, no, I don't. Again, like none of these guys are giving me the vibe of like we have no idea what's going on. We're just golly gee, these record execs stumbled into town and we don't know what's going on here. Like no, everyone's clued in.
But the funny thing about it is I've interviewed a lot of bands that have talked about this phenomenon. But, in the aftermath of Nirvana going to #1 with Nevermind, every big record label wanted a new Nirvana. Like, that was the thing. They had to find it. And so they signed, like, every band throughout America that, like, was playing college towns. And they did it, it's like the mule with the spinning wheel. Who knows how he got it? And danged if he knows how to use it. But all these labels had these like indie bands from these like smaller regional scenes that they were trying to market as the next big thing, and they just had no idea what they were getting into. And so idea how to do it. Like I remember interviewing Jay Robbins from the band Jawbox a few years ago, and they signed to Atlantic, and he said that they like sold more records than they ever did in their whole life, but the label still saw it as a disappointment because it still wasn't enough for them, and the president of Atlantic Records even said something along the lines of like, I don't get you guys, but I trust our A&R guys, so good luck.
Well, that's kind of like in the Zappa documentary. It was the same thing. It was like, I don't know, these kids are into all kinds of freaky music. We'll sign these guys too, like they, there's no difference between them and the mamas and the papas or whatever else, you
right.
know. It was just sign them up, and so yeah, when these things happen, I think you just cash in.
One of the really good talking head segments in this is the his name escapes me right now, but he has a couple good moments. But he says that the record industry is like a baby Huey that stumbles over to Athens and sits down, buys a few people lunch, signs 20 bands, kills 5, and then stumbles over to Minneapolis and does the same thing, stumbles over to Seattle. And I think that was basically what happened for 10 years. You know, that
was Steve Fisk,
Fisk, yes.
He produced a lot of my favorite records by the band Unwound. So
okay.
I have a Jack and Dino segment. If you guys don't mind, have you guys read his article from Backfire Zine in the summer of 2000 that created the term "to Jarl"?
No.
So yes,
lay it on us, Andy.
Please impart this wisdom, Andy.
So Jack and Dino coined the term "yarling," which is the description for the vocal tick of the grunge era, and particularly Eddie Vedder.
Okay.
And then later on, like Scott Stapp and that sort of thing. He writes, "To yarl is to sing melodramatically with a sort of barely suppressed letter R sound lurking beneath every other syllable. When I mention it, people always know exactly what I mean. Steve Turner describes it as singing as though your lower lip is stuck way out." And he spells out phonetically here that Creed is the expert, and he spells "Can you take me higher" as "Kranru Trake Muri Higher," and then he describes this as singing like a pirate. But so it's interesting. So he created this term "yarl," and now that's what I hear whenever I hear people sing this way. But he argues that although people were aping Seattle by doing it, he thinks it basically wasn't really done in grunge, really.
I would agree that it doesn't. It's more like the grunge 2.0.
Yeah,
does it?
I mean, even Eddie Vedder, like, he kind of mumbles, but I don't think it's anywhere near like what Chad Kroeger would do or anything like that.
I think Vedder does it in Hunger Strike.
Yeah.
Maybe not otherwise.
He did it in Hunger Strike, and then he's like, "That's terrible. I'm not going to do that anymore." And then
everyone else was like,
"That's
I'm stealing that."
That's the thing, right?
It reminds me of a term that, Jeff, I honestly don't know if you came up with it or if it's a friend of ours came up with it, and we've used it over the years, but it's for a similar sort of like the like grunge aftermath style of singing, which we refer to as hunger dunger dang.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's the same, right? That's
it's basically the same.
Yeah.
I think I read it in an article on like the AV Club a long time ago.
Okay, so we're just stealing someone else's.
I think
it sounds familiar.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so Andino adds, "The problem is that the current crop of yarlers are copying their shtick from our homeboys Lane and Eddie V, who are actually quite restrained at yarling. Eddie hardly did it at all after the first PJ album. Chris Cornell never did it, nor Arm. Lanigan and Cobain sure as hell didn't need to. Nonetheless, it's now considered Seattle singing to some people. Sigh. Friends don't let friends yarl. Please stop the madness."
That's so interesting. Again, it's like the idea that this like sound gets prescribed to a scene that didn't actually use it. And again, it's like the whole grunge thing. Like, man, I do not consider Soundgarden to be a grunge band.
Yes. No, I agree with that.
Alice in Chains to be a grunge band.
They're both. They're two of my favorite bands of the whole sphere, and they're, I think, closer to metal than they are to for instance, what like Mudhoney was doing. I also love
Mudhoney's very much like a grunge band.
Yeah,
they're sort of like the prototypical, like that's what grunge sounds like. Yeah.
So somebody in the movie just says like, "Look, we were just playing dumb hard rock music." and this just became a thing. And it's like, they just wanted to get together, drink some beers, play some dumb hard rock, like Black Sabbath style, Led Zeppelin style, and Here we are, 30 years
it's
later.
fun. I mean,
If I can wax poetic a moment,
please wax on.
The style of music that, like, particularly Mudhoney was very good at. There is something truly magical about bands and musicians that are extremely talented, that have technique that can just like blow your mind when they are adding a layer of sloppiness on top of it, so that it's not like when you hear a sloppy band that's just sloppy. Like, that is one thing. When you have these like really technically skilled musicians that are intentionally like sloppifying their music, which is like something that I think of Mudhoney, like a more contemporary band that does that. We've talked about Jeff and I, Parquet Courts does that.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's so good. That level of like, I'm so tight that I'm playing it loose.
Yeah.
Like, that is just great to watch.
Like, did Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath invent that? Or does that go back, I mean, because that's kind of what they do.
I don't
too,
know. Right? Black Sabbath is definitely like that kind of band. It's interesting though, because I watched, there's like a whole series of like classic albums. Like, it was it's not the BBC, but there was like a British production company that did all these like hour-long things, and I watched one on Black Sabbath's Paranoid. for the people at home, in case but a big thing about their sound is that Tony Iommi is literally missing a couple of fingertips, and so I don't know if like that makes a difference, or like that's the kernel of their sound, is that like he just plays differently by necessity. It's hard to say, but obviously they're a very talented band, but it's just
I have to think it predates it. I mean, I can even imagine like jazz age type, like really tight musicians performing in like speakeasies that are kind of like where that would be, you would basically be getting that same vibe.
Yeah. I mean, I think
they're great, but they're playing rough, right?
Yeah.
I think of like bands like Crazy Horse, who it's very like, Neil Young's been called the godfather of grunge, so there's something there. But obviously very talented group of musicians, but what they're sort of famous for is just like really just like bashing it out. Like, especially if you hear their live recordings, like it's heavier and noisier and nastier, and I think it's just more fun that way. You like, if it's too tight in a way, it just seems like a little antiseptic. Whereas like if you're just like playing like a motherfucker, then like I think everybody just has more fun with it.
Is that why nobody sprung for Steely Dan?
Exactly, David, right there.
Perfect. Yeah, so I mean, and Dino, I listened to an interview with him, and he defines the sound as like riff heavy hard rock, like Zeppelin, The Who, riff heavy hard rock, but just with a punk sensibility. Not necessarily like a punk sound, but just like bringing that mentality to riff rock.
I think because the punk sensibility, like, truly was, we don't know how to play our instruments. Like, I effing love punk, but even like early punk bands will tell you that about their bands. It's like, we didn't know how to play our instruments, and that's how it sounded.
Well, television did, but that's another story.
Now we're getting into another.
Why isn't there a television rock doc? Is a question that I
would watch the hell out of that.
I would. If anybody wants to pay Treblezine to produce a television rock doc,
crowdfund that bitch.
all the big rock doc producers listen to this show, so it's pretty much guaranteed to happen now.
It's gonna happen now. Yeah,
Jeff, you and I have talked a little bit at one point about like kind of contemporary bands and artists that are either grunge/grunge influenced. I don't want to necessarily put you on the spot, but I mean, it just seemed to be kind of having a moment. I mean, I went and got lunch today with my wife, and our server was like wearing Doc Martens and had a like look that was straight out of my high school era.
Oh, the 90s are back.
Yeah. And so maybe we picked the perfect moment to talk about this movie, but as a quote unquote music journalist, I'm underlining that because you're the only person with authority here to speak about it.
Are you questioning my credentials?
I'm not questioning. No, that was my only way of highlighting it or underlining. It's emphasizing.
Okay. Yeah. It's written in capitals, not in quote marks. Yeah.
No, exclamation points, David. Exclamation music journalist.
Yeah, that's right.
Just like hype with the exclamation point.
Yeah.
As the only real music journalist here, what's going on with grunge? Is it back? What's happening, man?
I wouldn't say it's back necessarily, but there's a lot of bands that are influenced by it for sure. I mean, you listen to like does anybody subscribe to Sirius satellite radio?
I do. Yeah.
Here. Okay.
I only listen to the Fish channel though.
Okay. Well, fair enough. On XMU, which is sort of like the indie rock channel, there's a lot of bands that you'll hear that grunge influence kind of seeping in. I have a couple of bands that I like a lot that definitely have like a grunge sort of aesthetic. It's a little different though. Like what's happening now doesn't necessarily sound like the bands that were active in the 90s, but they just kind of take that influence. Like Speedy Ortiz is a band that I like that kind of has a grungy sort of sound. They're from Massachusetts, so some of that might be borrowed from Dinosaur Jr. They're probably also tired of getting compared to Dinosaur Jr. But another band is Charlie Bliss, who basically like take the like grunge guitars but like make this like really just extremely catchy pop music. And so like I love what they do, like great vocal harmonies, like very much a pop group, but it's just like that grunge production style is kind of what sort of sets them apart. And so there's a lot of that happening with younger bands who were definitely too young to be experiencing it the first time.
Yeah, totally. But they were probably handed it pretty early. They had an older brother or a dad who was just like, "Oh, you like music now? Listen to Alice in Chains." Or
definitely.
So let's let's bring this home. And I mean, Candace, you kind of alluded to this, but at the end of these episodes, we just talk about like the question of, would you recommend this? Is it a good movie for somebody who's not already versed in this, in this case, it's more of a scene rather than a specific artist. But if you're not just already a diehard fan of the Seattle grunge, whatever era, but just a fan of music in general or documentaries, do you think this movie holds up as a movie?
I think you have to be aware of what we talked about early in the episode, which is that it is a documentary style of its era. For some people, I think it's going to be a little too like slow and plodding, just in terms of the pacing. But like, there's so much great information. I think what you learn from all of the different artists that they talk to is really interesting. Like the best way I can describe it is like, this is what it's like to hang out with a group of musicians for 2 hours.
I think that's
how it feels to me.
For that reason, I would recommend it, because I think it's, for a lot of people who don't play music and don't spend time with musicians, you probably like don't really see a lot of how the sausage gets made. And that's kind of why it's interesting to me. I am familiar with a lot of this stuff, but it's still interesting to me because it's sort of like, this does ring very true to me. Like this feels like a very authentic document of a scene. And I feel like we're, these, while there is a kind of knowing like sense of humor about the whole thing, I do feel like we are getting their authentic selves. And I do feel like we are getting a good snapshot of like what it's like to be in an underground scene, especially when it experiences this weird sort of surreal big medium moment. And San Diego experienced something similar to that a few years later. Never quite got off the ground, but everybody was looking for the next Seattle, and San Diego was one of the places they looked for it. And I don't think they ever found it, but they gave it a shot.
Yeah. I'm with you guys. I think this movie, I can spoiler alert, this is going to be heavy in my rotation for rewatching, because just like everybody's just fun to hang out with. It's it's like totally. It's just chill vibes. I could sit here and laugh with these guys and girls for an hour and a half whenever I just need some comfort food.
I mean, like how real and authentic it is in terms of like, there's literally a moment where I don't even remember what band it is. They're like walking through the space where they rehearse, and it's like, like they're walking down this corridor and they're like, okay, this band's over here and this band's rehearsing over here. Like Jeff and I are like 95% sure we've actually rehearsed in that building.
Nice.
Yeah. We're just like, damn, I think we rehearsed there once.
Yes. Every band's giant rehearsal space is the same.
Yeah. No, like it's the literal. My brother has a band in Seattle that I'm pretty sure that's the building they rehearse in. Like, I don't know for sure, but it
was eerily like, wow, I think we've actually rehearsed in that building.
But to your point, yes, all rehearsal spaces look exactly the same.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think first of all, what we didn't mention was that this documentary is pretty short. I think it's like less than 90 minutes. So it does kind of like, you get a lot of music and a lot of interesting characters in a pretty short amount of time. It's not, some of them can be, I mean, sure, if you're doing 4 hours on the history of the Eagles, and you've got the greatest documentary of all time, great. But
kill me.
Well,
Candace,
wait for that
we've been
episode.
doing so good. Do not talk ill of the history of the
good.
Eagles.
We love that movie.
90 minutes, under 90 minutes on grunge. Bam, I'm there. 4 hours on the Eagles. Oh God.
Yeah, I know. But
I'm not defending the band. I'm just saying it's the greatest documentary of all time. So,
they had no choice but to give us 15 minutes about the writing of the song "Get Over It" during the Hell Freezes Over tour. How could they have cut any of that?
All right, we know the second all 2 gold. Hours is not as good as the first. Look, okay. So anyway, that said, this movie, it's short. And it is kind of tight but loose, like you guys were saying. Like, it's loose. It's a little raggedy. It's not as polished as a contemporary 2021 documentary maybe would be. But on the other hand, it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of charm to it, I would say.
Grunge itself.
Exactly.
It is. Wow. It is quite. Yeah.
It didn't sell out, man. It kept it real. I would not put this. I wouldn't put this in a paper slicer and destroy this documentary.
I want to just piggyback off of something that Andy said about how, like, it's sort of comfort food and you like hanging out with these people. Like, it feels like hanging out with our musician friends, in San Diego. It's like, yeah, we know people that are exactly like this. Like, this is, and that's what makes it fun. I think it's sort of like, you relate to these people in a way, and they just, you want to hang out with them.
Yeah, the guys from Tad on the couch, also awesome segments.
Cool hang.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for doing this. Again, check out Blood Ponies on Bandcamp. Support music by paying for it.
Yes.
And also Trouble Zine, which also has a Patreon. Support music writing by paying for it. And
yes, please. And it goes to all of our writers. So
there you go. Exactly. Nice. They're actually paying writers. They're not some grisly content farm churning out
like the assholes at Rock Docs who are
exactly. There's no compensation happening. Yeah. Anyway, thank you guys so much for doing this. This has been Rock Docs.